what really defines who you are as a person is what you choose to cause you pain. Like pain, oh my God, this is certainly upbeat, but life's filled with pain, right? But what pain you choose to give yourself. There's some that you have no choice, right? It's going to hit you. You're going to lose people. You're going to be hurt. You're going to fail. But you're also, if you decide, I'm going to run a marathon, that's painful, and you chose it. You say, I'm going to have a difficult conversation with someone because it's going to make my life better. That's pain. You chose it.
Drew, welcome to the podcast, man. Great having you.
I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So talk to me about leadership. What does leadership mean to you? Because it's so broad. We're often so scared of it. And just tell me what you think leadership is.
Well, it depends on what month and year you're asking me, I suppose. Like my definition of leadership has always veered away from what we've traditionally been taught. It's about power, money, influence. And what it is otherwise has evolved over time. I used to say that leadership is striving every day to behave in ways that make it more likely you'll have a positive impact on your life and the life of other people, which is a terrible definition. It wanders, it meanders. And so now I actually like to think that leadership, for a long time, like I'd say the last 3-4 years, I've been talking about leadership as saying leadership is striving to close the gap between the person you want to be and how you are actually behaving. Like that for me is where leadership exists. And I want to be clear that when I talk about leadership needs to be defined more broadly, I'm not saying that everybody can or should be a CEO or a senior manager or run a company or wants to. What I am saying is there's a form of leadership to which we all can and should aspire. And that is identifying how we want to behave, what kind of impact we want to have, recognizing that there is a gap between that hope and how we're actually behaving. And then I think that key personal leadership is recognizing the gap exists, acknowledging that it's your responsibility that it's there, and then having a plan every day to close that gap just a little bit. And one of the things that we've been talking a lot more lately is leadership exists in these powerful moments of interpersonal impact, moments of compassion, moments of kindness, moments of forgiveness, of recognition, these individual moments that have historically, I think, been dismissed as the little things. You ever notice that these incredibly powerful moments, these things that we do to change the course of how people feel in a day, we call them the little things? Oh, it's the little things that you do. When did that happen? They're not little things. They're the most powerful, important things that we do. The moments of interpersonal contact that you have throughout the course of the day with the people you work with the people you like, with the people you don't like, they have a much bigger impact on your daily life than anything a president does or a CEO does. And yet leadership, when we talk about it, is all about those individuals and very little about these individual moments that make up the vast majority of most of our days. They are far more impactful in our days than anything the traditional leadership we've been taught about does. So I think that what we need to start to understand is that not only are we ignoring most of the leadership that we demonstrate every day, we're actively minimizing that which we do recognize. And so for me, leadership exists in powerful moments of interpersonal impact. Leadership, therefore, is consciously creating those. For instance, one of the things that I often push back against is the phrase, hey, I really get into these, random acts of kindness. I get the concept there. I understand what people are trying to get at, but I really don't understand why we are so enthused about random acts of kindness when what leadership is conscious acts of kindness, conscious acts of forgiveness, conscious acts of empowerment, conscious acts of resilience, which I know is a big focus of what you folks have. Leadership's closing the gap between who you want to be and how you're actually behaving. And it's doing it by consciously ensuring that you engage in powerful moments of interpersonal impact every day. That's a form of leadership to which we all can and should aspire. It's not the only kind, but since all of us are capable of that, why I like to talk about it is those powerful moments of interpersonal impact. They're pretty much the only source of power on the planet where there are not systemic barriers between that power and most of the people on the planet. Like almost every form of power on Earth excludes most of the people on Earth, is not accessible to most of the people on Earth. But the ability to create these powerful moments, that's accessible to everyone, which is why I think it's so much more important to focus on that, which we have control over, than focus on power, money, influence, and titles, because those are inaccessible to a lot of people. And what we do is we teach everyone that that's what leadership is. And I think we make a lot of people believe that leadership isn't for them because they don't think they're smart enough, or they don't have enough money, or they don't have good enough grades. But I think a bigger problem is they do not have access to the opportunities that a lot of the people who stand up and are held up as leaders have. And so that's what leadership means to me. It is about interpersonal moments of impact. And I swear to God, the rest of my answers will hopefully be shorter than that.
No, that was a great one, and I love it when our guests really go in depth in a question. So that's perfect. So how can we really? You first talked about this gap that we have from the person that we want to be, like our ideal selves, and who we actually are. How how is that a part of leadership, and how can we close this gap?
I think the first key is to have a plan. See, one of the things that I believe I try to help people do is identify their personal values and then have a plan to create them every day. Because I think the gap between good leaders and great leaders is good leaders will live their values anytime they get the opportunity. Great leaders create opportunities to live their values. There are all kinds of good people out there who, anytime they have the chance to show integrity or kindness or accountability, they seize it. But what I think really sets people apart are the ones who go in with a plan. And so for me, the first step is, what are my values? Like, what is it that I use to make decisions? Because we throw words like values around a lot. But let me ask you, man, what's a value? Because it gets thrown around all the time. So I'm going to
Yeah,
turn this back on you. What is a value?
I would say it's something that you find meaningful, specifically in the way in which you interact with other people or the environment. That's my personal definition.
Yeah,
Something that
it's
you value
yeah.
in
I
those
mean, the big thing,
interactions.
it's one of those terms we use all the time because it sounds good, but we
Yeah.
have absolutely no idea what it means. But we don't dive too far into it. So for me, a value is a set of criteria for decision making.
Hmm.
I think a value is only a value if you use it as criteria to make decisions. So for me, closing the gap between the person you want to be and how you're actually behaving is identifying what criteria you want to use to make decisions.
Hmm.
And I think acknowledging the fact that for most of us, and myself included, the criteria we use to make most decisions in our lives is, all right, which one of these options will avoid the most consequences right now?
Hmm.
The challenge is avoiding consequences and violating values pretty much go hand in hand all the time. And so for me, closing the gap is about, okay, let's identify some values we care about. Let's define what they mean. And then let's create a plan to act on them every day. So go into the day with a plan. And that's really what my work is all about, is helping people figure out what their values are. And then through a process I call operationalizing leadership values, actually making sure that you're living them every day.
Hmm.
Because what I've often found is people talk about what their values are, but here's a little insight I've discovered, mostly since I left university, is that the phrase, I'm the type of person who, is almost always followed by a lie. Like,
That's why
what's
they need to
true?
state it.
Yeah, what's true about your character isn't announced to the world, it's demonstrated.
Hmm.
So for me, that's what's key, is saying, okay, here are the values for which I stand. Most importantly, here is what they mean. Like, here's the definition. Because if you don't have an actual definition for what actions are associated with integrity or honesty or accountability or friendship, you can't hit a target where that you haven't defined. You can't cross the finish line where you have no idea what it is.
Hmm.
If we don't define our values, all right, impact is a commitment to creating moments that cause people to feel as if they're better off for having interacted with you. Courage is a commitment to taking action when there is the possibility of loss. If you don't define what your values actually mean, you don't turn them into a finish line so you know when you cross them, you could be, and you probably are, embodying your values every day of your life, but you're never giving yourself permission to celebrate that fact. Like, most of the moments where you are being the person that you want to be are passing by unrecognized and uncelebrated by you. And I think that one of the keys for me is that it's the celebrations in our lives that give us momentum and give us pride and give us strength. It's the celebrations that do that. And for me, I believe that setting goals is basically planning celebrations.
Hmm.
And we set goals for our academics, and we set goals for our career. We set goals for our finances. I believe that a personal culture of leadership is spending just as much time, just as much energy, just as many resources setting and chasing goals for your character. So for me, closing the gap says, here are my values. Here's what they mean, defined by using the phrase a commitment to. And then I don't know how far you want me to get into it, taking those values and those definitions and having a plan every day to act on them, to make sure that the phrase, I'm the type of person who, isn't a lie, that it's actually backed up by evidence. And more importantly, when you set out a goal to meet your values and you recognize when you do, what you're often doing is you're giving yourself evidence that you're actually a good person. Like most of us do not like ourselves. All right. Like it's like this natural thing is to keep. And I think part of it is because like, you know, every lie you've ever told, you know, everything, like every rule you ever bent, every obligation that you didn't live up to, you know them all. And so they bounce around in our head and we don't see them in other people. And so I think that knowing every bad thing we've ever done inherently makes us believe that we are those things. And one of the hardest things for me to realize, especially as a guy who's a recovering alcoholic, who's bipolar and didn't know it. So you have these moments in your life where you're not necessarily fully aware of or in control of your behavior. One of the things I started to have to come to grips with is that you are not the worst thing that you've ever done. And the worst thing you've ever done doesn't define who you are as a person. Denying the worst thing you've ever done is different. But I think that's a really key piece. So I lied about the short answer.
For sure. I love that you bring this topic of self-forgiveness and really being compassionate with yourself into leadership, because if we're not compassionate with ourselves and we're hurt, we're probably gonna hurt others. Like I've heard you mention that phrase quite a lot: hurt people hurt people. So
Yeah.
if we don't really tackle that those grudges that we hold against ourselves, how can we start to be a better leader? How can we start to be a better person?
The grudges we hold against ourselves is an amazing phrase. And I never thought about it that way. So I'm going to benchmark that, because in leadership, you never steal an idea. You benchmark the best practice. So I like that a lot. I also love the fact that you say self-compassion. I had a former student write her thesis on self-compassion, which is different than self-respect, different than self-esteem, different than self-love. Compassion, I wish I could remember exactly how she put it, but compassion isn't necessarily forgiving yourself for every bad thing that you've done or every time you fall short. It's recognizing that that's okay, right? Like even when you haven't yet found a way to forgive yourself or let things go, compassion, I think, is all about, it's a commitment to being okay with yourself when you're still working through stuff. I think that's what compassion is about. I think compassion happens when you're in the middle of something. Well, forgiveness happens afterwards, if that makes any sense at all. I've never really thought of the difference between the two. And it's why I love doing stuff like that, right? Because in the middle of a conversation, you think, I've never considered that. How about this? Cool, I'll put that in my next keynote.
That's awesome. For sure, man. And what you talked about, really measuring that progress, like patting yourself in the back. I think it was George Washington. Don't quote me on that. I could check it out later, but I'm pretty sure he had this list of values that he wanted to embody. And every night he would like jot a check mark right next to the value if he did embody it. And each month he would try and tackle specifically a new value. So really having this sort of system and measuring it every day or every week is super crucial. But I feel like most of our decisions, most of our leadership decisions, or most of the things we do are on instinct. And we really need to get more systematic if we want to surpass our human nature.
Yeah, Stanford actually put out a study that said 80% of the decisions we make in a given day aren't actually decisions, they're habits. And I was blown away by that, to think that 80% of the actions you take in a given day, you're not actually in control of anymore, is a little bit disillusioning, right? And, it's funny about George Washington. I'm sure he didn't say half the stuff that he was supposed to have said. And since you mentioned him, I'm now singing a song from the musical Hamilton in my head on a loop. So I'm going to try to stay focused. But it's interesting, the last step in what I was talking about in the process, you just reminded me of it, because the way that we approached it, and when I say we, I used to be the leadership, I used to run the leadership program at the University of Toronto here in Canada. And so when I say we, I usually refer to a small group of senior leadership students. And one of the things that we adopted once we identified our values is this sort of mindset. I throw this out to everybody watching because it's really been a game changer for me. Imagine if every night before you go to bed, you have to prove you deserve another day on this planet. Like, not at the end of a semester or a year or a quarter or a 5-year strategic plan. Like, every single night before you go to bed, you have to prove you deserve tomorrow. And the way that you prove it is you have to pass a test, end of every day. It's a 6-question test, and you have to have answers for 3 out of those 6 questions. But the key is that you're given the questions in the morning. If that was the case, those questions would be non-negotiable, right? You wouldn't answer them between classes or meetings or emails or picking up the kids. Like, they would drive your priorities and your decision making every day, because that's what you had to do to remain on this planet. And the way we looked at that is, okay, the test we created was tied to our core values. So we identified 6 core values that we wanted to live. And just so people know, it was impact, growth, courage, empowerment, class, and self-respect. These aren't the only values that are important, and they're not the only ones we try to live up to, but these were the ones we say, okay, like George Washington, let's actually create a target we can hit. And, for impact, it was, what have I done today to recognize someone else's leadership? For growth, what did I do today to make it more likely someone would learn something? For courage, what did I try today that might not work, but I tried it anyway? Empowerment, what did I do today to move someone else closer to a goal? Class, when did I elevate instead of escalate today? And self-respect, what did I do today to be good to myself? And the idea is that by going into every day saying that to deserve another day on the planet, we have to identify answers to 3 out of those 6 questions. Because the key to those questions is, you cannot answer one of those questions without living up to the definition of its value. Impact, a commitment to creating moments that cause people to feel as if they're better off for having interacted with you. Question, what did I do today to recognize someone else's leadership? Like, you can't tell someone that they're a leader to you, that the way they do their job, the way they live their life, the way that they've treated you or other people has made you want to be a better person, has inspired you, or has opened doors for you. You can't tell someone that and not have them walk away feeling better for having interacted with you. So it's impossible to answer the question without living the value. And not to dive into it, because ask if you want, but it's based on some behavioral psychology, why we chose questions, because the human brain hates unanswered questions and will adapt your behavior unconsciously to find the answer to a question that it's working on. And so we said, okay, let's get 3 out of those 6 questions. That's the steps that we took, so that at the end of every day, we could say, all right, there you go. We got 3 of these 6. And the idea of what I call the leadership test is it acknowledges, and if there are any students listening to this especially, like, it acknowledges that it's this crappy reality, but it is our reality of life, school, work. You're not always in charge of what you get to do every day. You're not, but you're always in charge of who you are. But if we don't flex that reality, we don't use that muscle, that power of being like, this is who I am, and I'm going to carve out time every day, you forget you have it. And so by tying the questions to the values of your life, what you demand of yourself is that you prioritize your to-be list at least the same level as your to-do list. Mm-hmm. And I think what was really hard for me when we took on that approach about 10 years ago is that my students are in their early 20s at their latest, right? I'm in my 30s, and it was hard to take a look at my life and realize how long it had been since I could honestly say that most of my decisions and priorities and behaviors in a given day were driven more by the person I wanted to be than the shit I had to get done, right? Like, if you look at your life, you should have obligations. You should keep them. You should be proud of that. But if every obligation you have in a given day is an obligation to somebody else, you're living a life of obligation. That's incredibly disempowering. if you say 10% of my obligations in a given day are obligations to me, and for me, that means answering 3 out of these 6 questions, what you're effectively doing is leaving 90% of your obligations out to the world. That's a life of service. 90-10 is a life of service, but you got to carve the 10% out for you, because the idea of the leadership test basically acknowledges you're not always in charge of what you got to do every day, but it's supposed to be a roadmap through uncertainty. Like, even if everything outside of your control in your life blows up in your face, and we have all bloody well had that, especially the last 16, 18 months, you can at least look back at the end of the day and be like, yeah, today was a loss. Like, I got the crap kicked out of me today, but here are 3 moments where I was the person I wanted to be. And there are some days where it's all you got. That is all that you get. I did a talk called the Lollipop Moment, and I give speeches that people seem to respond positively to, but I am not sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows. Like, the world is a crappy ass place, but in those crappy ass moments, I think we got to remember that we have power. We have power to impact our own lives, and we have the power to impact other people's lives. And crappy things make us feel powerless. And so what I wanted to do is create a leadership process that worked on lousy days, right? Like, any process you give someone that only works when you have extra time or having a good day is a crappy ass process. So that's the leadership test for me. That's my George Washington piece, right? So, hey, it's funny too. George Washington willingly left the White House after 2 terms because it was what's best for America. Oh my goodness, how the times have changed.
For sure, man. For sure. And it's that living up to your values and really knowing what those values are. Like, step 1, I feel, is crucial. And obviously they could change, but if you were starting over, how would you go about carving those values out? Like, do you have a specific exercise or a specific thing to do?
I do, actually, and it came from my students. It's weird, eh? I make a ton of money off ideas that my students gave me, though I've openly acknowledged that for them, and they seem cool with it, as long as I mention them in the book. This is what happened: is one of my students wrote an article. I think it was his 23rd birthday, and he wrote a blog post, and he said 23 things I've learned in 23 years. And I was like, damn, that's like, it was really insightful. I was really proud of him. And then somebody asked me, like, within a week of that, what advice would you give, to an incoming student or whatever? And I thought, you know what? The problem with picking one piece of advice is that you get really intimidated by having to pick like a life-changing single insight. Life doesn't work like that, right? And so I wrote my 30 things I've learned in 30 years. And what I now do to help people surface their values, and the problem with talking about the process is it works better if people don't know why they're doing it. But because I won't actually get to do a workshop with most of your listeners, try this. Okay. Sit down and put together what I call your edge of the bed advice. And that means, imagine you have a kid, all right? Or just look at it this way: someone that you love so much, you want them to have a better life than you did. Imagine that it's their last day at your house. And maybe they're going off, getting married, going to school, starting a job. And they come into your room, or you come into their room, and you sit on the edge of their bed, their last night under your roof. And they look at you and they say, what do I need to know? Like, what insights, experiences, successes, failures have most contributed to your happiness? And the question, what in your life has most contributed to your happiness, is actually something that we should spend more time asking ourselves. Because we seek happiness. And I think sometimes we'd be better off identifying what brings us happiness and seeking those things. Like, we seek happiness as it is, but I think one of the key things someone taught me is, well, instead of chasing happiness, think about when it's been in your life and what are the commonalities in those things. So don't seek happiness, seek the situations, the people, the experiences, and the places that bring you happiness, because they're identifiable. Happiness is sometimes ethereal, it's hard to grab.
Yeah.
And so sit down and think about that. Write down 30 pieces of edge of the bed advice. 30 pieces of edge of the bed advice that you would pass along. So now you don't have to worry about one piece that's got like is the key to everything, right? And be funny, pick some that are funny. It means that you just have flexibility of sharing all kinds of things. Serious tips, funny tips, somewhere in the middle tips. For me, it was things like, There are three things you need in life, or you are going to miss out on a great opportunity one day. Two saved up vacation days, an up-to-date passport, and the ability to drive stick. Those three things you got to know in your life, or you will miss out on a great opportunity. There are more Rosalines out there than Juliets. Like Rosaline was the woman that Romeo pined after at the beginning of Romeo and Juliet. He couldn't live without her. And then we never hear about her for the rest of the play because he meets Juliet, and which is what he really wanted and needed. And I think that a lot of the jobs that we want, or the relationships that we want, the opportunities that we want in this world, they're often Rosalines. We think we must have them, but they're probably not a Juliet. And then the other piece I put on my top 30 was just also remember that Romeo and Juliet die at the end of that play. Love does not conquer all. Love, however, has a really good winning percentage. Love is basically LeBron James. You're going to win more often than you're not, but it ain't guaranteed. And so you should adjust your expectations accordingly. Love doesn't conquer all. And so think about those things. And one of the ways to do it is sit down, and you don't have to do it all at once, but pick a topic and just ask yourself, what do I know to be true about? So what do I know to be true about love? What do I know to be true about friendship? What do I need to know is true about grief? Pick any sex, drugs, rock and roll, anything you want. Just pick a topic and say, what do I know to be true about? And write down what you know to be true about any of those topics. And what happens is you have 30 tips at the end. A piece of life advice is actually has as its foundation values. When you give someone a piece of advice like love doesn't conquer all, what you're actually saying is if you take this value and you live by it every day, if you take this piece of advice and you live by it every day, you're going to do a better job embodying the value of whatever. Every piece of advice has at its root foundational values. This piece of advice is given to you to help you live this value. For, love doesn't conquer all. It's about resilience. It's about self-awareness. It's about self-respect. It is about, God, I can't remember what the other one was that I did it. But for every piece of advice, ask yourself, okay, what are the foundational values? 1 to 3, I usually give each one. What are the foundational values here? For the ability to drive stick, etc., it was adventure was one of the values there, right? It was spontaneity was one of the values. So you go through your list and you reverse engineer the values at the foundation of every one of your pieces of advice, 1 to 3. It means at the end of the list, you should have between 30 and 90 values listed. 3 to 6 of them are going to show up way more often than the others. I don't know what they are, and sometimes you won't know what they are. But if you do that, if you create the foundational values of your 30 pieces of life advice, you'll have between 30 and 90 values if you go 1 to 3 for each. And 3 of 6 of those values, they are going to occur way more often than the others. Those are the ones that you then transfer into daily action driving questions, and how to do that is a whole other question. And those become what you start with for your leadership test. Your leadership test should start with one question. Start with one question for 30 days. Then you add a second and you try to get 1 out of 2. Then you add a third, you try to get 2 out of 3 and onward. I don't suggest anyone go more than 6. Some people roll their life with 2, 3, 4. Everybody's a little bit different. But that's the exercise I tell people to do. It's also awesome. Like just to sit back. Like, let me ask you, my friend, give me a piece of edge of the bed advice from you. Like something, I mean, you do a podcast on all this, you talk to genius people. Give me 1 or 2 pieces of edge of the bed advice.
Definitely one would be like, failure is an iteration to success. And it could be the value behind that could be like resilience also, and being okay with failure and self-love and constant learning. So that's how I started to view failure recently, and it's helped me a lot. And I know it's the key. Well, as I said, the key to some success. It could be professional, it could be spiritual, it could be whatever.
Well, it's interesting, man. It's like failure is reps for your resilience muscle, right?
Yeah.
Like that's how you build muscles, is you do rep after rep, and that's what failure is. And for any of your listeners out there, for what it's worth, like the education system teaches us to avoid screwing up and avoid failure. because it teaches you begin everything at 100%. Every mistake you make, you lose points. You never get the points back. And, the first time we were ever given a grade, we realized, well, why are they grading us if it's not to rank us? And why would they be ranking us if it isn't to make sure the people at the top get something the people at the bottom don't get? And so it teaches us to avoid failure. And for what it's worth, and I'm sure you realize this too, you are way better off spending time in your life learning how to deal with your failures and bounce back from them than you are trying to avoid them.
Yeah.
Like nobody avoids failure, nobody avoids screw ups. And yet I don't understand, we don't teach that you are a better leader if you accept you're going to screw up and put all of your focus on becoming the type of person who can survive your screw ups as opposed to the type of person who doesn't make them. But school teaches us to not be the ones who make them. It tells us that when you make mistakes, you lose points and you are worth less than the people who don't make mistakes. But the people who don't make mistakes often don't take chances, right? And it's created a system where we are less concerned with how wise, how skilled, how talented, and how strong we are at any given moment. And all the focus is on how few mistakes we made along the way. And it's just a terrible setup that we've done. And we've made some of the most brilliant, strong people you can imagine think that they're dumb because they send them through an education system that says, okay, the goal is to make as few mistakes as possible. And no, the goal in life is to recover from as many mistakes as possible. And what a stupid ass training we're giving for real life. And one of the things about the leadership test I often point out is that people hate tests, like not anybody's favorite thing. But if you think about it, man, it's because for the first 20, 25 most formative years of your life, every test you have to write is somebody else's test. Like somebody else gives you the questions, demands the answers that they want, and then grades you on how well you deliver what they want. That's every test that we write for the first 20 years of our lives, and it sucks. But what you really start to discover is that the only tests that truly define who you are the ones you choose to give yourself. Like that's what defines you. What really defines who you are as a person is what you choose to cause you pain. Like pain, oh my God, this is certainly upbeat, but life's filled with pain, right? But what pain you choose to give yourself. There's some that you have no choice, right? It's going to hit you. You're going to lose people. You're going to be hurt. You're going to fail. But you're also, if you decide, I'm going to run a marathon, that's painful, and you chose it. You say, I'm going to have a difficult conversation with someone because it's going to make my life better. That's pain. You chose it. What the pain you choose for yourself is a big definition of who you are. And the tests that define you are the ones you choose to give yourself. And I remember that discussion I had with someone when we were like, damn it, you know what really defines us is what we choose to hurt ourselves. Like my buddy does 100-mile endurance races. Like who does a triathlon and is like, yeah, you got anything bigger? But he chose that pain, and that pain defines him, and it's built him into who he wants. So instead of trying to avoid pain in life, try to become the type of person who bounces back from it, who handles it, and then realize that the pain you choose, the challenges you choose to take, the failures that you bring upon yourself because you take on things that are too hard for you, that defines who you are. And I think it's worth realizing that. And when you trip and fall or you do something and you're like, why am I doing this? Because I am bigger and I want to be bigger and I want to be better and I want to be tougher than I was yesterday. And like leaders figure out that life isn't about not screwing up. They figure out that life is about becoming the type of person who can handle it. And for me, it's all about not screwing up that we teach people as opposed to teaching them to how important it is to heal, how important it is to be resilient, especially the last 16 to 18 months, man. There are two categories of people that are going through the pandemic, and you can tell the difference between them. There's lots of categories of people, but they can also be divided into these two. Those for whom the pandemic is the worst thing that has ever happened to them, and those for whom it is not. And you will find that people who are handling this better are the ones for whom it is not the worst thing that has ever happened to them. It just isn't. However, for all of you who it is the worst thing that's happened to you, remember this. This experience will be what gives you strength the next time you face something incredibly difficult, because we should not forget the battles we fought and won. And I think that one of the things I tell people is when you're trying to get through a difficult thing, think of the worst day of your life. Now, for some people, bear in mind that only you know if thinking of the worst day of your life is damaging to you. Sorry.
Don't worry about it.
But only you know that. But one of the reasons is like when I'm dealing with something profoundly difficult, I think of the morning where we found the woman I loved after she had died by suicide. One of the most horrifying days of my life, but it actually is the source of profound strength, because anytime I'm sitting there and I'm just beaten and I'm like, I can't do this, I remember that day. And I remember on that day, I thought, I cannot live another day after this. And I did. And so always think back to the toughest day you've ever had and realize that you beat it. And you probably didn't think you were going to at the time. And for me, that means that the worst stuff in our lives is actually the source of the greatest strength when we face the next thing. Sometimes the things that bring you closest to breaking are the things that keep you from breaking in the future.
That's beautiful, man. And I appreciate you sharing that. And for sure. And if you're someone that, oh, nothing bad has happened to me in my life or whatever, you should actively put yourself in those situations where tough things will happen. Like go on hikes or run marathons, or put yourself in those extremely hard situations so you do have something to look back on, right? Some people have it easier than others, which is a privilege. But then whenever something does happen, they don't have that training, right?
Hey man, I was born a straight white guy in Canada. People ask me, what would you do if you won the lottery? Yeah, I already did. Like honestly, I mean, we all go through crap. And I mean, this is something that comes back. People are like, oh, stop hammering on straight white guys. I'm like, I'm not saying we don't go through crap. I am saying that there's a bunch of crap we don't have to go through. Right. And I think that's the big difference, is that like I am very privileged that many of the challenges I face are manageable because of my privilege. All right. Because I can get through it because I've got a good job. All right. I can get through it because people will give me second chances, or people will give me the benefit of the doubt. Right. We saw that with Simone Biles this week.
Yeah.
Right. Like the fact that obviously there was going to be pushback from that anyway. But if you don't think that the fact she's a Black woman has something to do with how viciously she was attacked, you're not living in the same society we are. And so I get the benefit of the doubt when I screw up. Right. People are like, oh, there must be something behind it, or like there's things that we don't know. That's not what Simone Biles gets. All right. That's not what young Black man killed by police get. All right. So I think it's important to recognize, even those of us who have gone through hell, that we are still ahead of other people sometimes in how we can navigate through it. Right. I kind of look at it, man. I've been through bipolar, alcoholism, and losing the woman I loved. Like, you want to take me down, you better bring some kryptonite. But I always try to remember that. I think of those really difficult things I've gone through. Never, ever forget the battles that you have fought and you have won, and give yourself credit for that. And just remember, like, anytime someone's like, I can't make this, and I so get that, man. I've been there so many times. I ask them, and I'll ask you all this. I want you to tell me about the time that you did not survive something you faced. Like, tell me about the time. I often will say to you, okay, like, cool. The last time that you didn't get through something, what did that look like? And then people have to stop and realize, well, there isn't actually a time I didn't get through something. I'm still here. So just always remember that. Like, there is not a single instance in your life where you failed to get through a challenge. Now, doesn't mean you like how you got through it. Doesn't mean that you didn't leave pieces of yourself behind, or that you don't carry scars. I'm not saying that. But you have beaten and gotten through every challenge that you've ever faced because you're still here. So why do you assume that the next challenge you face you won't get through? There is no statistical evidence at all that that's true. Like, if every day of your life you walk out your front door and nobody hits you in the face with a pie, it seems silly to ever assume that the next time you walk out the door, you're going to get hit in the face with a pie. And so if you have beaten every challenge you've ever faced, even if it hurt on the way through, it makes no sense to assume that you won't get through the next one. Like there's no empirical evidence that that's going to happen. Now, unfortunately, we live in a world where empirical evidence is no longer all that important, but at least on your own level, you can do that for yourself. You've beaten everything you've ever faced. For the love of God, give yourself credit for it.
For sure. And that's great.
Sorry, a
And
little rant there. I apologize.
that's awesome. That's awesome. And how do you think, grief and going through bad moments and really having those challenges that shape you as a person, how do you think that is tied to leadership?
Sorry, what was the last part of the question?
How do you think that grief and having all these challenges that really shape you as a person, how do you think those moments are then tied to leadership?
Wow, what a great question. I guess the key pieces are empathy and perspective. Like, I think that you'll find that individuals who've really gone through crap just have a different perspective on the world and are much slower sometimes to to react negatively. Or if they do, they bounce back quickly. Like I get really angry sometimes or frustrated, and then I think about that morning and very quickly perspective. And so I think that the ability to step back and realize that it was a young refugee who said to me, only hurt people hurt others. And then she said, but if I want to be the type of person I know I can be, I have to let go of the ways that people have hurt me. Otherwise, I will carry them around with me and I will one day use them as a weapon against someone that I love. And to realize that for most people, if they're hurting you, it usually has nothing to do with you. It is hurt that is being transferred through them that someone gave them. And the person who hurt them, it was probably transferred through them. And so what I found is that when you've gone through crap, when you've gone through grief, what it does is it reminds you, it allows you to take a look at every moment that comes afterwards and compare it to things. And it opens your mind to a couple of things. One, I've gone through worse, I can bounce back. And two, who knows what this person has gone through? And it's not easy. It doesn't mean you do it every time. But I remember when Anastasia, that was the woman I love's name. I remember I didn't cry for like 2 months after she died. I think it's because the experience of finding her, like you can't process her death because all you can process is how you discovered it. And that is such a brutal experience that it's hard to remember her as opposed to who or what you found. And I didn't cry for like 2 months. And then I remember I was driving through Idaho, of all places, really pretty place, by the way. And I was listening to this podcast called The Moth, which is a storytelling podcast. And this woman who was a chaplain for the National Park Service, and therefore was always called when someone died in a national park, was talking about death and how people dealt with it. And all of a sudden she said, was it step courageously into the house of grief? For grief is just love squaring up against its oldest enemy. And I don't know why, but there was something about that which was exactly what I needed to hear to finally let myself grieve. And one thing, the reason I tell people that is, one, if you're going through grief, there's something about that phrase that I just found so incredibly comforting. Grief is just love squaring up to its oldest enemy. And I just pulled off and I lost it for like half an hour. But the reason I tell people that story is because that woman was telling her story. And not only do we need to be resilient, and not only is coming back from hurt a big part of leadership, or keeping committed to your values even when hurt, because hurt will make you incredibly self-centered. And that's not a bad thing, right? When you are in pain, you have to pay attention to yourself. So pain and grief makes you self-centered. And that's okay. Like, forgive yourself for that. It's not your emotions that get you, it's you judging yourself for having them. But I think that one thing we should realize is that part of leadership is also finding a way to share the things that have helped you with other people. And that's why this podcast is leadership. And she was telling her story. And her story, which I think had been told 3 years before, it was a rerun of the podcast, reached this guy who needed it in the backwoods of Idaho 3 years later. She doesn't know that. I hope to find her one day and let her know that. But we have a responsibility to share our stories, because the story is the basic unit of human understanding. And you have no idea what piece of your story is going to resonate with somebody else. And too many people think that their story is, they either can't or won't share their story because they think it's boring or unimportant or doesn't stack up to other people's. Like, share your story. Because look, from a really young age, you know what we get taught? You want to impress people, you want to be a leader. Do things that make people look at you and say, oh, wow, I can't do that. That's what's impressive. But one of the things I found, it's why I talk about stuff like this, is maybe the biggest gift you can give other people is to act in ways that allow them to look at you and say, oh my God, I thought I was the only one. Like, I thought I was the only one hurt by that. I thought I was the only one hiding that. I thought I was the only one afraid of that. Like, it's why I started talking about being bipolar, is we still live in a world that equates mental illness with mental weakness and pays lip service to mental health, right? Oh yeah, we should take care of our mental health until it means you skip the Olympics or you pull out of the US Open. I mean, that's just a couple of like high profile examples. So it's like people like to pay lip service to mental health, but they do not forgive people or understand when people actually do stuff for their mental health. And I started talking about it because what I found was, when I actually started sharing it, I thought my career was going to be over. I was told by people I respected that you can either talk about leadership or you can talk about your experience with mental illness. You can't do both, because it'll undermine you in a career where my career is premised on the idea that you will find my ideas credible. And people don't find mentally ill people's ideas credible. And so they're like, you got to keep that to yourself. But I watched my students struggle with it, refuse the help they wanted and deserved, because they were afraid of three key things. One, they were going to look weak. Two, they were going to be an embarrassment to the people who cared about them and had supported them. And three, they were going to be unemployable. That was their major fear. And that was my fear. It's why I didn't say anything. But when I watched my students struggle, I thought, well, maybe if I do it, it might help if I talk about it. And that's what I found. My career didn't get destroyed. What I found is all these people stood up and said, oh my God, I thought I was the only one. And now we have this network of people who can support one another. Your resilience is not just yours. All right. It is something that needs to be supported by other people and then needs to be shared so that other people can feel your support as well. I think we just covered like 9 topics there.
No, that is awesome. And sharing your story really can help other people that are undergoing the same thing. And if you think that your story is not as extraordinary or as adventurous or whatever, I'm sure there's a lot of people that don't have super extraordinary, super adventurous lives and go through the same things you go through. Like, my sister watches blogs that are extremely popular in YouTube, and she's just like doing her makeup, like brushing her teeth, doing things that are not very extraordinary, not very adventurous, but a lot of people can relate to that. That's why telling your story is really so important.
Yeah, we can't all relate to each other's experiences, but we can usually relate to each other's pain. And pain and fear are the things that most people will relate to, or we've often shared, right? And so it's why those things can be used to bring us together. On a political level, they're used to divide us, fear and pain. But on a personal level, they can be used to share and support one another. And like, it's the difference between leaders and politicians, right? Like, the difference between those two things, because not all politicians are leaders. The difference between those two things is how people use fear. And politicians add fear to try to win. Leaders try to remove fear so that more people can succeed. And to me, that's the main difference there, is that we equate leadership with influence. And then we're like, oh, they're just bad leaders. No, if you're a bad leader, you're not a leader. All right. There are only good leaders. People who have influence and use it poorly are not leaders. They're catalysts for harm. And I think that, I've never actually made that statement out loud before, but there are no bad leaders. If you're a bad leader, you're not a leader. What there are powerful influencers who create negative harm. They are catalysts for harm. And what we need to do is stop teaching that there is more than one type of leadership, in terms of you can be influential and make bad things happen, and you're just a leader, a bad leader. No, you're not a leader at all. And to put the title just because people are influential or they're catalysts for something big doesn't mean they're leaders, doesn't mean they're bad leaders, doesn't mean they're, using a different style. They're just not leaders. And if we can start to teach kids that leadership only exists when people are engaging in values that are designed to expand things, expand opportunities, expand experiences, expand rights, expand access. When you make decisions that are designed to expand access, respect, dignity, rights, just confidence. When you use values that expand those things in your decisions, that's leadership. When you use your influence to limit rights, to limit opportunities, to limit respect, or to enrich yourself first and foremost, it's not leadership. Not going to say that those people aren't influential. I'm not. They're massively influential. That's the problem, is that a value isn't a value if it's designed to restrict things for other people, if it's designed solely to enrich you only. Some people have argued, well, your self-respect question, what have I done to say to be good to myself, therefore isn't leadership because it's all about you. Okay. My broader belief is that the more I respect myself, the better I treat other people. Because I think a lot of the crappy treatment we give to other people is we treat other people how we think we deserve to be treated. You don't like yourself? You're going to treat other people like shit because you think that's what you deserve. And in many ways, what happens is it creates a cycle where you are treated like crap. And deep down inside, we think we deserve it. And so I think it's really important that recognizing that self-respect isn't being all about you. What it is if you're treating yourself well in order to feel better about who you are, to believe that you're a good person, how you respect yourself has a direct impact on how you perceive other people and how you treat other people. Now, when you do things so that you get richer, when you do things so that you have more power than other people, that's totally different than treating yourself well. That's about consolidating influence and power and whatever, which you use to help you. And more importantly, you use to hurt others. And so I think when you respect yourself, you don't see other people as such a big threat.
Yeah.
And really, at the foundation of every organizational and personal dysfunction is a fear. People are just afraid. They're afraid they're going to have something taken away, or they're afraid, money, their job, respect, influence, or they're afraid they're going to be given something they just can't handle, like a bigger responsibility or something they don't have the skills for, or they don't have the time for, or maybe they just don't feel they have the mental capacity for. Everybody who is fighting with someone else in your organization, in a friendship, in a relationship, in the country, it's because they're afraid of something. And the problem, I think, is that we address the dysfunction on the level of the behaviors that emerge from the fear rather than the fear itself. And anytime you step back and you've got people you're angry with or you don't understand or you're in a battle with, one of the best questions you can ask yourself is, what are they afraid of? And realizing that often what they're afraid of isn't wrong to be afraid of it. You might feel that they shouldn't be, but if you're like, oh my God, that's scary. Like I am a big proponent of reasonable and smart gun control. But I also know that people who stockpile weapons, who are like, oh my God, the government could at any moment just march in and demand that we do whatever they want. Well, that's not an irrational belief. It happens all over the world. The idea that it could happen tomorrow is a little bit crazy, or that we just finished with someone who was more likely to do that than any other person in history. But I do understand that fear. And so when you recognize that the fear is valid, you can start being like, well, how can we make people less afraid? How can we talk together? Because I know what I'm afraid of. Like, it's a valid fear to worry that someone's going to walk into your child's school and gun them down. That is a 100% valid fear. it is also a 100% valid fear that you will lose the opportunity for the freedom you care about. Both of those are reasonable fears. When we accept that they're both reasonable fears, then we can act as leaders and come together and say, what can we do to alleviate both of our fears? Because the idea is that the other side doesn't care about yours. They think it's wrong. These are all valid fears. The challenge is that it's the behaviors on top of it. And some people really, really, really benefit from us being afraid of each other. It's a small group, but it's influential. But that's not leadership, right?
Yeah.
It's influence. Anyway, we just kind of got off there, but I just think it's about resilience is about finding a way to not be so frustrated that you give up on the hope things can get better, right? Like being so hurt, being so beat, being so frustrated that you simply give up on the idea that it will ever be better. And I think that when we recognize that it's fear that drives a lot of those things, and instead asking, okay, what am I afraid of? What are other people afraid of? And what can we do together to alleviate all of our fears, as opposed to saying you're wrong for thinking it, or worrying that they're going to do something that means your fear will be realized. I think that's resilience. I think that being willing to believe that there's a better way is resilient, because you believe that there's something better than what hurt you. And the problem is you get hurt enough, you get worn out enough, you get told it'll get better eventually enough. Eventually you stop believing it. And that's where we really need strength and resilience and leadership and personal leadership. It's the whole idea of the leadership test, is that there are days in my life where I'm like, I'm screwed. Like it's over. And then at the end of the day, I look and I'm just like, hey, I showed courage here, I showed self-respect here, and I showed impact here. What a crappy ass day. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that if I behave every day in a way that embodies at least 3 of the values I claim to stand for, I don't know what the future holds and I don't know when it's coming, but I do hope that I'll be proud of the man that gets there. And I think that living your values every day, giving yourself evidence of it, I think that's where leadership starts. Because when you're capable of doing that, you start to realize that you're capable of even more. And in the process, all those moments of impact may be making other people capable of more too. And that, to me, I think is leadership. And it exists in those individual moments. But those individual moments of impact can be as easily bad and damaging as they can be positive. So let's be deliberate about our values, and let's be deliberate in how we live them. And let's try to minimize the amount of decisions we make unconsciously. Because usually when we act unconsciously, we don't act in a particularly good way.
Drew, I've really enjoyed this convo. I think everything you've said has tremendous value, man. I'm grateful for everything that you've shared. I'm grateful for you coming on. Are there any last words or anything you want to end with?
That's always a tough one, man. Yeah, go out and answer this question. What have I done today to recognize someone else's leadership? Leadership recognizes, leadership created, and like just tell someone, former boss, or best friend, parents, teachers, whatever. Like just let them know that they've been a leader in your life. A text, an email. We always assume they know. But when somebody moves you, when somebody changes you, tell them. I mean, I get tweets from people or DMs, and it's just like, I'm sure you get a million of these, or you might not even read these, but I wanted to let you know that, your TED Talk or your book or whatever did this. And I'm just like, why do you assume this won't matter? Like, oh, I'm sure you get millions of these. I'm sure Beyonce gets millions of them, right? Like, no, Beyonce gets millions. I get a couple a week, right? Like, and they always matter. So if you got a musician, you got an artist, like off to the side here, I have a letter from Lin-Manuel Miranda, who, who composed Hamilton, which fundamentally like changed my life in a lot of ways. I know that sounds goofy. So I wrote him a note and said, I just wanted to let you know, like, this is what this meant to me. This is what, this meant to my girlfriend. Like, it was something that we shared together. And I get a note back. Like, I just assumed it would never get there. If people move you, you know them, you don't know them, they're famous, they're not, send them a note to recognize their leadership and the impact that you've had. Maybe they don't write back, but they do read them. And also remember that they're probably getting a lot of hate. no matter who they are, what they do, social media is more often used to hurt people than it is to help. So answer that question today, everybody. What have I done today to recognize someone else's leadership? Recognizing someone else's is an act in and of itself of personal leadership. Plus, it has the bonus of helping two people out, right? Go
Thank
forth and do that.
thank you, Drew, man. I appreciate it.